He's waiting for me.
Oh, so funny. Everybody can hear me without the mic. Can you hear me? You're the only person that's here, so I'll just shout. You do need the mic? Okay. All right. Okay. All right. I'll use the mic. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for those of you who stuck around. 6 o'clock is a bit of the graveyard hour. I'm Teana Baker-Taylor, and I lead policy and regulatory strategy at Circle. And I'm going to be giving a talk today on essentially what's happened in the regulatory climate over the last couple of years and where we're headed toward now, and how this either provides a barrier to entry or perhaps a aid to adoption. So I'll leave it to you to decide. Essentially, we're going to cover kind of the evolution of regulatory tension, what it looks like today, and what the future holds through the lens of regulation, governance and trust, and risk management. So the regulatory attention today, up until today, has consisted of essentially, countries being really quite slow to wake up to the development of crypto assets and what they could potentially mean for financial services and other uses across blockchain technology. Countries first started making statements around crypto during the 2013 bubble, so that's when it first became on everyone's radar. And these primarily consisted of warnings to investors about the risks associated with crypto, primarily Bitcoin, so not good signals. These charts that you'll see are from the Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance's regulatory report that they produced a couple of years ago. The first regulatory authorities to issue statements about crypto tended to be central banks through the lens of what is money, followed by government departments and then financial supervisory authorities. And what's notable here is that until this point, we kind of saw a broad aggregate of regulators looking at crypto, but little activity from legislators, and that becomes important later. So most countries need to legislate to change laws before regulators, and in some cases central banks as well, can take any action. One of the key challenges that the industry and authorities have both struggled with is taxonomy. So what do we call things? And if we don't all use the same language about what these assets are, then it gets really confusing for everyone. So we've seen pretty significant changes in regulators' terminology over time, and this is due to, in my view, ongoing engagement and education with those regulators so that they understand how these assets are different and how they work, and how they differ also from fiat money. And the early use of virtual currency, you see there's a huge proponent of agencies using that language, really kind of conveyed a really unserious implication. But as the need for serious regulation has become clearer and our advocacy and education engagement with policymakers has stepped up, we've seen regulators begin to adopt the terminology that's more widely used by us, crypto asset, which reflects the diversity of the products and services being created and is inclusive of NFTs, governance tokens, etc. So this is critically important when it comes to actually legislating the rulemaking that regulators will be working from. So we've jumped from 2017 to 2019, and we start to see countries taking regulatory actions. So as we know, early approaches to crypto asset oversight and regulation were primarily focused on square peg, round hole approach, just kind of wedge it in there. And countries were trying to make use of the regulatory frameworks that they already had in place. But unfortunately, these processes had been fraught, given that most regulatory frameworks don't have provisions for how to oversee financial assets and financial market infrastructure that can be self-custodied, for example, that doesn't involve a cohort of intermediaries, and that uses open source technology. So jurisdictions with lower adoption rates reacted more slowly, and they were more likely to ban usage because it was easier than addressing the issue, given the exposure to crypto was lower in their countries. So you can see here about 11% of lower adoption countries attempted to take a bespoke approach. But even in jurisdictions where adoption was higher, there was a moderately higher attempt to address regulating crypto through a bespoke regime, only 19%. Okay, so this map gives us kind of a flavor, a bit of a heat map across the state of regulatory play in May 2019. So we've jumped ahead 2 years. It doesn't detail which regimes are bespoke or new or retrofit, but it does show how the world is reacting at this particular moment in time to rulemaking for crypto. So until this point, smaller jurisdictions like Switzerland, Malta, Gibraltar, and Bermuda had really led the way in outlining regulatory regimes. But by 2019, you can see that the major markets are now responding, primarily bringing AML and KYC requirements into the fold and bringing market participants into existing, so we're back to existing, e-money or money service business type regulatory regimes, most notably in the US and in the UK. For me, Japan is notably missing from this map. Japan led the industry in combining bespoke regimes with a really unique model for regulatory oversight. And they did that through an SRO, which is a self-regulating organization. So essentially what they did was they took the regulator, the FSMA, basically appointed the country's trade body and said, you oversee the industry, and here's a guideline and a set of rules that you need to enforce. And believe it or not, it worked relatively well, and it still works today. And we talk to a lot of jurisdictions about this potential model because for the industry, it is more productive to be self-governing, and ultimately we'll probably find, blips in the matrix before any regulator is going to. So today's regulatory environment, there has been some considerable changes. So we got a new heat map. And so you can see there's a lot more green on this map than there was in 2019, but we also see a lot more red and pink. So recent amends to this map that I would have made if I had more time were that Russia should really be red, based on the new law signed by Putin this week, excuse me, effectively banning the use of digital assets for payment or goods and services in Russia. And while it's not an outright ban, it's a continuation of anti-crypto policies laid out in their digital currency bill, which was introduced last year, I think, but was amended last year. So it was introduced 2 years ago and amended last year to really curtail crypto trading and mining. There's been positive development in the Nordics, South America, and the Middle East. But one thing that is certain when you look at this map is that there is a lot more color and a lot less gray areas. So regulators have absolutely woken up. And not only have they woken up, but we're starting to see new legislation. So in the beginning, I said lots of kind of regulatory retrofitting because there wasn't legislation. And legislation is what gives us the opportunity to have bespoke frameworks. So now we're starting to see policymakers or lawmakers kind of wake up and standard setting bodies more in major markets with a focus on bespoke treatments for crypto. So just in the past 12 months, we've seen the US President's Working Group report on stablecoins. I actually expect that a bill will be leaked this week from that President's Working Group Ethcc review to regulate stablecoins in the US. There's been major congressional hearings on crypto. The Fed published a CBDC paper. The ECB has announced a CBDC trial as well. The UK, just today, about an hour ago, proposed the Financial Services Markets Act, which is going to bring stablecoins and crypto asset advertising into the regulatory perimeter. MiCA was approved last month. Yeah, we're in July. So there's a lot of things happening here. And that just gives you a little snapshot. So who plays a role in making these rules? I think this is really important because we all focus on the regulator. Is the regulator going to do something? Why don't they regulate? Why are they regulating? And really, there's a whole myriad of players that contribute to rulemaking. And so it's kind of important to note here is you have the legislative branch, you have the executive branch, and then you have national agencies. And within that, then you have supranational regulators or policy standard setters as well, like FATF or the Bank of International Settlements. And what we've seen over the course of the last couple of years is they've all become quite competitive with each other, right? Everybody now wants to be the first to issue rules. And so through that, we're starting to see legislators actually push back in a number of these cases, namely in the US, the UK, and the EU, basically making new laws instead of allowing regulators to retrofit. I personally think this is better for crypto overall, but it definitely does take longer. So here's a snapshot of what, now we've jumped ahead, we're at 2020, and this takes us out through 2024. And this just gives you a bit of a highlight around all of the things that are happening today. And you can see there's a lot, right? So this is a tiny, tiny snapshot. So the plethora of regulatory and notable now legislative activities being undertaken has exploded. So I talked about the President's Working Group. There's a number of bills in here that have been introduced in the US. So the Digital Commodities Exchange Act would basically give the CFTC a lot more permissions than the SEC, kind of ending the debate around what's a security and what's not and focusing on what's a commodity. Really interesting bill. The Responsible Financial Innovation Act, you probably have heard of it as the Lummis Bill or the Lummis-Gillibrand Bill. So that came out recently and is being debated. Today we expect a bill from the House Financial Services Committee to be leaked from Maxine Waters and Representative McHenry on stablecoins. So there's a lot of legislative action. I talked about the UK's legislative action, I talked about MICA, but then you can also see there's other activities here. France put in place a crypto asset framework. Singapore has become a lot more, has done more scrutiny around what they're allowing, and they've banned crypto advertising, similar to what the UK has done. So this is just to give you a sense of kind of what's happening in the space and how things are heating up. So for anyone who's been through a number of these crypto cycles, you'll know that crypto markets have grown really through explosive bull markets and pretty brutal bear markets. And the last bull that we experienced, I believe, was a direct result of what I call the cleansing that took place during the last crypto winter. And the opportunistic and value bereft token projects basically evaporated and were replaced with a period of building, which resulted in a litany of new products and services. And I think that the most recent down cycle actually reflects a maturation in the industry, and the reasons why. So we've had similar, smaller, relatively smaller price drawdowns. Institutional inquiries are still high. Regulatory interest is at an all-time high. So if they believe crypto isn't dead, I don't think that anybody else should. And new products and services are still launching every day. But extreme volatility absolutely freaks out policymakers, right? Their primary mandate is to ensure monetary stability and consumer protection. And I would argue as volumes and participation grow and the demand for crypto becomes more mainstream, the requirement for equivalent levels of governance and risk management also increase. And if you disagree with me, let's just think about what's happened just in the past couple of months. So the chart that we're looking at shows the Luna USD price. The dramatic crash of Luna, once the third largest crypto token, has wreaked absolute havoc on the lives of investors. When crypto prices started collapsing, a number of companies found themselves pulling what I said was a kind of a move from the 1920s playbook and just started freezing withdrawals. So, it was reported that stable gains took USDC and USD from customers, promising them 50% returns, put all the money into Anchor, didn't tell them, skimmed 4% off the top, and then ultimately lost $42 million in customer funds, and they've shut down. Then we had Celsius. They wanted us to unbank ourselves. And then this week, they've hired a bank so that they could declare bankruptcy. Three Arrows Capital starts to unravel, and now we're seeing creditors lists on Twitter. And I think that if we can all agree that these show operational governance and risk management failures in these examples, and if I'm a regulator who's listening and watching this, I, start to really kind of challenge that narrative that crypto is going to enable financial freedom, and I'm going to be reasonably skeptical. And the other thing, I was just discussing with a friend the other day, we were looking at the Twitter thread with the 3AC, investor exposures, and I got a little bit of shit for this, but essentially the due diligence that is taking place between investors is on Telegram. Now, I use Telegram. We all use Telegram. But, typically when you're doing due diligence, there's documents, there is, email audit trails. I mean, maybe I'm just like an old fuddy-duddy, but to me, this didn't feel like, adequate basic risk management. So what does the future hold? What's the direction of travel? We talk a lot about clarity. We want regulatory clarity. I think we're getting that. I think it's more about the codification of what that regulation is going to look like and what it means in practice. The industry is working with policymakers to develop viable frameworks for regulating crypto asset activity. And I personally believe that the implementation of thoughtful, fit-for-purpose frameworks will encourage billions of people to enter the Web3 ecosystem with more trust and greater confidence. And that trust and confidence is really the key. Confidence that holding your asset on a balance sheet won't negatively impact your business. Clarity around how crypto should be accounted for and taxed may be a bit boring, but it's critical for institutional adoption and growth. Competitiveness at national levels will also ensure that greater clarity and assurity for builders is presented and should create better opportunities for major markets who are now vying for your attention to move to their jurisdiction and set up your company. And globally, there's a cry at supranational levels for harmonization of regulatory treatments. So crypto is a global asset and moves freely around the world, but if you're a multinational firm trying to accelerate in a number of jurisdictions, it's an operational and compliance nightmare. So harmonization should greatly improve this. I think there's two key things that I, think that we haven't yet really solved for. And policymakers have addressed broadly concerns around AML and KYC and concerns around privacy and, AML and KYC they've kind of solved, but concerns around privacy and consumer protection, namely around safeguarding customer funds. So when someone goes bankrupt, where does your crypto go? Those are kind of the key areas of concern today. And privacy and self-sovereignty need to reach parity with technology. Educating policymakers on the difference between pseudonymous and anonymous is still really difficult. And with the rise in interest around CBDCs, I think privacy discussions have never been more important than they are today. So if you're interested in building something, this is an area where we definitely need more examples of how blockchain technology can solve challenges in new and different ways, which plague policymakers, the challenges that plague them. And if we don't, I predict that we'll see more policy where policymakers apply existing governance methods, which aren't fit for purpose. So anybody remember the travel rule? I mean, that was a mess and essentially captures 1% of money laundering today, but they would have had it did it anyway. So if we don't, when I walk into policymakers and I say, oh, well, it's transparent and, we can solve for this and we can solve for that and we can, digitize identity and we can, tokenize KYC, and they're like, great, who's doing that? And, it's in theory, somebody needs to build it. And my own personal bugbear, I think we need to build more user-friendly services that are not only easy to use, but easy to secure. So using crypto today is still too hard. I relatively know what I'm doing. There was a question earlier in another panel about, are you digitally native? Maybe I am, I don't know. But I just, sent a bunch of stuff to the wrong chain, literally 3 weeks ago. Gonzo, bye. And I sat there and laughed at myself, like, how did I just do this? But I did. Because the interfaces I were using were clunky, and I wasn't paying attention. So these services need to be accessible to the least geeky among us. And again, jurisdictions will implement different laws, but the world can coalesce around standards. And I think that the industry has really taken the lead in establishing best practices which address policymakers' concerns. And if we don't set the bar high, they will set it for us. So what is our role today? What can we do? So my key takeaway for you today, if you remember anything I've said, please let it be this. First, go build something. Go build something cool and useful. Make products that users love. Improve the user experience. Please do that. And continue to push the boundaries of technology and innovation. Good examples of what crypto is good for and how it is used help advocates like me speak to policymakers and help the industry. Who, these policymakers just don't understand what the value is. I get asked often. So, what is it good for? People are just speculating on the price. I know that we're building cool stuff. Build more of it. Behave yourselves. Just because you can doesn't always mean that you should. Be prudent about what you're building. Think long-term about the success of your protocols, adapts, and how your users will fare in good times and bad. And, honestly, I also hear this a lot from regulators. Just drop the hubris. When you walk in and you say, blockchain's on the cutting edge, it's decentralized, all of the keywords that we use, that hubris that you can't regulate DeFi, for example. Well, they can turn the power off, right? So plan that in. Understand that there are going to be expectations around risk management and governance, and dedicate resources to manage that. Seek good legal counsel, and don't treat your compliance team like they're bench players. And finally, be engaged. Start following reliable sources of information and find out what's going on in the regulatory and government world. Join trade organizations or donate to organizations or people that you think represent your interests. And most importantly, if there's something that you have expertise in, make the time to explain it to somebody like me so that I can explain it better to the people that are influencing the rules that we'll be governed under. So that's it from me. Happy to take any questions. Thank you guys for staying. And if you come up with a question letter, my DMs are open on Twitter.
Thank you for this presentation. You mentioned the question of TFR and the obvious lack of the crypto technological sensible approach that there is. Do you have some work inside Circle on being more proponent? Because I think a lot of regulation are a bit by default applying all recipes in a sense, or have you identified places or trade organizations where you find the possibility to suggest that? Because as you was underlying, I think in your presentation, is also a lot of DeFi protocol don't make the effort to really propose something, which I think should be the work. But yeah.
Yeah. So, I think that from the kind of trade body or advocacy space, that has also improved a lot. There are, for DeFi specifically, there's the DeFi Education Fund. They do a lot of work globally. And a direct result of active advocacy, you mentioned the TFR. So everybody doesn't know, within Europe, kind of adjacent to the crypto asset bill that they pushed forward, there was a transfer fund regulation, which basically detailed what information I needed to send during a transaction, and similar to the FATF travel rule. And they wanted to have no de minimis on transactions. So basically, every single transaction that was ever sent from any exchange. And they wanted to ban, basically, exchanges being able to send transactions to a unregistered, unhosted wallet. So that's like your personal Trezor, right? Or your ledger. And so that would have been disastrous, right? That bill basically was amended in the very, very last, minutes, the last weeks running up to it being implemented and voted in, because the industry spoke up. And they did that through a couple of different avenues, and DeFi Education Fund was one. I personally have done a lot of work with FATF, And FATF was looking to, in this cycle, so this year in June, their new guidance came out, and they had intimated that they were going to look at addressing how they were going to regulate DeFi and NFTs. And so we spent basically 6 months negotiating with them to say, look, we don't even know enough about how these assets could potentially work. And so if you start putting rules around them now, they're going to be preemptive, they're going to be not fit for purpose, and they're going to stifle innovation. And so FATF backed off. So when you, not everybody has the time or the money to be, advocating at, the government level, or the inclination, right? It's not always a fun job, and that's not your job. Your job is to build things. But it is helpful if you guys give us the information so that we go in and we can speak confidently about what's going on and about the potential future opportunities, and that's always helpful. So good firms to look at would be DeFi Education Fund, CCI is another one, crypto something Google CCI, I can't remember what it stands for, Crypto Council for Innovation, I think. In the US, Blockchain Association, the Digital Chamber of Commerce. In the UK, there's Crypto UK, there's Blockchain for Europe. There's a number of organizations that you can contribute to that are having these conversations on a daily basis. Great. Well, thanks you guys for coming. Appreciate it.